All right, so today I'm gonna go through and assemble the final Game Boy. We've already soldered the screen, set up the screen, soldered the screen to the board. Now we have our buttons, membranes, the bracket for the screen to hold it against the shell. We have our rechargeable battery pack as well we'll need at the end, so we'll set it off to the side. And then within the case comes with a set of screws and the light channel for the power. So we'll get those open and ready. Set that light channel over here so I don't forget it. There have been times I've basically put the board in and realized that I've forgotten the light channel, and then you got to take it back apart. So all right, so we don't need the back of the shell yet. We'll need the front. I'll set these off to the side. So basically there's a bevel edge all the way around. The screen has a beveled edge as well. So once you set it in, it's gonna auto center. It'll lay in there flat, and then the bracket will go in behind it to hold it against once you put the board in. It's a really cool setup. I really like what they do. So we'll just set their screen in here. Make sure that sits in there. Get our bracket. So the bracket will have a tab at the top right there. That tab sits underneath this little plastic overhang. So you just want to angle it in and then set it down. Now it may bounce a little bit. As long as these pegs are inside the two plastic pegs on the shell, you're good to go. We need our membranes and our buttons. So let's get those. We got our buttons as well. Now some of these we won't use right away, so we're gonna need the AB, we need the D-pad, and the rest we can set off to the side here. We'll need those once we actually put the board into the front of the shell. So adding the light channel, there's a little, might be difficult to see, but there's a little notch. It can go either way, so there's two notches around the outside. That sits right next to that screw peg on the shell. Okay, let's get our buttons in. Now you want to make sure that your B button is on the right hand side, and you have your A button on the left. They do have little notches on the button, so you know you'll be in the right spot and they'll sit straight within the shell. All right, put our start and select. Now the start and select has to go in after you put the bracket in for the screen. It does overlap slightly. Put our membranes for the AB, and then the membrane for our D-pad. Okay, so this is ready now for us to flip this over. So I think I talked about this a little bit before when I was assembling the screen and soldering. You want to make sure this runs basically straight across that wire. This one you want to come up and kind of go, take a 90 and move in towards the CPU. And then this one, you want it to sit just crossing over that cutout on the PCBA. And then this will give you a good routing so nothing gets pinched or caught in a screw hole. You have two screw holes, one right here and one right here. Okay, so let's just flip this down. The speaker does have a notch on the bottom, which needs to sit in the speaker slot on the shell for it to sit flat. So once you get it in there, you just make sure everything seats properly. Looks like it's laying in there flat. All right, and then we want to check the wiring. So it might be difficult to see, but that wire will go up over that post that comes down on the shell, and it'll go down behind the screen bracket. And then same with this side. It's difficult to see in there, but there is a slight notch on the bracket for the screen that wire will sit under. And then of course, you just want to make sure it's not in the way of that screw hole, which we're clear. Okay, so then what I'll usually do is I'll just kind of hold the screen here. And this is a good time to also check real quick. Just make sure your buttons are pressing properly. Just make sure you're holding the PCBA tight so you can really check it. Now there'll be 3 Phillips head shorter screws in the kit. Those are to hold the PCBA to the front shell. So we'll get, I usually put 2 in, so I put the one on the far right, and then I flip it, and I'll do the one on the far left. And then I'll test the Game Boy once I put the ribbon cable in. We want to make sure that the screen's going to turn on, that the buttons will actually do what they're supposed to, so there was no pinching, that the ribbon cable seated correctly within the Game Boy itself. So let's do that. All right. So what I found is, to get this to really be easier to seat, I use tweezers, and I go underneath and just hold that ribbon cable so the slack is up on the top end here, so I can actually get in there and slide that down in. It should go in pretty easy, so as long as you're lined up straight on the connector, you shouldn't have an issue. It shouldn't be difficult to push in, so you know you're in the right spot. And we want to lock the ribbon cable down. Okay, so now we can test. So I'll just hook up the bench power supply to give it a quick test. Make sure everything's going well before we get too far assembled. Okay. Turn this over so you guys can see. I'm just gonna hit the power, and there we go. Screen lights up, turns on. Let's hold the select to bring up our menu. We can change brightness all through 15 different settings with the triggers. So I'm just testing the triggers. So it looks like everything that we wired is working well. The screen's on, it's also working, so we can continue. So let's turn that off. Set these aside. Okay, now's when I'll put the final screw in. So there's a screw hole right below this capacitor. This is the final screw to hold the shell and the PCBA together. Okay. All right, everything still feels good. Okay. All right, so now we can assemble the rest of our buttons. So the side pieces are good to go. They can just go straight in. So you're just gonna make sure you have the correct one on both sides. There's no way to mix it up. They're slotted. They even have the little cutout for the lanyard here, so you know which one you're gonna be on. You can't mix them up. And then we'll slide our power button in, like that. And then this we actually have to assemble. So there's 2 little metal tabs, the little springs that go in for the triggers. You need to put those together. So we'll take those out. And then there's a little slot just in the end. I'm not sure if you guys can see that too well, but there's a little slot on the end here. So you just want to make sure that you're using the wide end of the tab, slide that in. And I usually push it against something harder. So off to the side here, I have a little harder part of the table, just to make sure it seats in there properly. So it should look like that. There's one, and we have to do it for both sides, left and right. Do the same thing here. Just slide that in, push it in, just give it a little push just to make sure it seats in there. And then you'll have both the triggers ready. Now when you assemble the triggers or put the triggers in, just make sure the bump out here is facing up. That's how it should sit, and you'll know you're in the right side. So these are just put the tab in and make sure they seat in the 2 holes in the front of the shell. Okay, we got functionality. All right, so you'll remove the back shell, the back battery cover. We're not gonna use this one because the FunnyPlaying rechargeable battery comes with one with a USB-C port cut out. Okay. Now let me grab We're gonna need a sticker here. Okay, so that's for the back of the shell, sits in this spot here. And then I always mark my boards with a stamp. All right, so we have everything set. The 3 screws are in, light channels in for the power. We have all the buttons, the trigger buttons, everything's in there. And then you're just gonna wanna set this. Now, the back shell has to slide over the battery terminals on the right-hand side of the shell on this side. And they'll slide and sit down in there. Now, sometimes it takes a little bit of, oh, it might be off just slightly. Just make sure. There we go. Okay. Now this side is, there we go. Okay. Should snap down in, the triggers should be free moving. And then it should look something like that. All right, so next there'll be a black screw in the kit. The black screw is for the battery area. It's also a Phillips. So I usually start with that one. So I already have the Phillips head bit in the screwdriver. Then we'll switch it out for the tri-wing. So the rest of the screws for the back are all tri-wing. And then we just need to button it up. So I usually start with the opposite end of the shell, kind of give it a push down, make sure those shoulder buttons are in their 2 peg holes within either side. And then just snug it down. All right, and then we got 4 more. Do the bottom corner. The other corner. And then the middle of each back, there's another deeper socket here for a screw. Make sure those are good. Okay. All right, so now we have the assembled Game Boy. Everything but the battery is in there. Should be all sealed up. Trigger should work. Shouldn't be any stiffness. Button should press properly. And then what I do now is I'll just put a set of batteries in. This is just to do another check before I go ahead and put the rechargeable in. Okay. And then we'll clean the terminals real quick on the cartridge port. And then we'll throw our test card in there. All right, so what's nice about this test card is you can basically test anything. It also checks for which version of Game Boy you have, so it'll know that it's a Game Boy Advance when you plug it in. So you just press start. That'll get you into the menu. We'll go down here to the buttons. And then we'll just test all buttons. So as you can see, I'm pressing around and just making sure that when I press, it's working properly. Everything looks good. It's pressing every time. Same with A and B. They're working, and we get start and select. And then to test the shoulder buttons, you just hit them. It'll make the widescreen versus the normal aspect ratio for Game Boy, because it is a Game Boy card. So it's a pretty good tool to use. You can test the screen options, sound as well. So let's go into, oh, there we go. But yeah, you can actually go into the screen. It'll test for stuck pixel, the tearing, ghosting, anything like that. and then sound as well, so you can go through here and just check different sound levels. And then if you do want to even check the buttons a little further, they do have a platforming test that you can go through. And it just lets you test the buttons, make sure it actually platforms well, they're working, it feels good. All right, so everything seems to be working well. It's reading the cart. The next step is now we'll take the batteries out. Set those aside. And then in order to install this kit, we actually need to pull the left side of the terminals out of the shell. These are not needed. They're just there if you're using batteries. Since we're using the rechargeable, it's just gonna connect to this side here. So we can open the kit. What comes in the kit is the shell with the USB-C charging port hole. Then you have your board and the battery as well. And those are the two terminals that'll hit there. We also have the plate that sits right on top of here. All right. So when you're installing this, you want to make sure that this cord is pulled like this, kind of up into this direction. It can get pinched on the shell if you're not, watching out when you set the battery in there, or down here, any which way it can get pinched. You don't want to do that. You can actually cut the wires or pinch them to the point where they won't work. So what I usually do is just keep that up in this way, put your terminal against, and it'll be a tight squeeze. Just make sure when you're pushing down that this wire is out of the way, and it should sit down in the shell right along this edge on both sides. And that'll keep it pushed up against the terminals. And then what I found to make this a little bit easier, because I actually channel the wire, it's hard to see, but I actually channel the wire through that part where this was sitting. So that way, when you connect the battery wires here, they'll sit in there, the extra wire can sit down in there. So what I'll do is I'll untwist just the last, 3/4 to an inch of the wire, and then make sure this is oriented the correct way. And then this will be a little bit of a tight snug, but it'll snap down in. You want to make sure that that connector is flat in there, seated correctly. And then before I just put the wires away and wrap it up, I'll just turn it on to make sure that the battery is working. I have had to, just disconnect and then reconnect, and I've got it to work, but it's usually just, that's not seated properly if you don't have it perfectly down in there. Okay. So then we'll run our wires through that small channel. Just make sure they're kind of down in there. And then you'll just wrap the rest of the wire into this hollow spot where that battery terminal was that we removed. There you go. Last thing is put the metal plate. It has a double-sided adhesive. It just sits right here. Just make sure that's snug down. Battery's in there nice and flat. And then what you're gonna do is just make sure as you're putting the battery cover on anytime you're doing this, just make sure that it's seated in the back. The USB port will go into the cutout here, and then you're just gonna snap it in place. And that's it. Game Boy is ready. Just real quick, one thing I did forget. So after I ensure that the Game Boy works, we need to actually put the serial number and information sticker on the back. So what I usually do is I'll take a cleaning swab, some IPA, and I'll just clean this just because I've been touching it, so my oils from my hands have been on it. There could be stuff from the factory when they were manufacturing, So I just get that nice and clean so there's a good solid stick for that back sticker. All right, now I usually use a magnifying glass just to give me a little better view of lining this up, because you do have to line it up freehand. There's no bracket or anything to use to line it up. And I always use tweezers. It makes it so much simpler. Plus you're not using your fingers to stick that sticker. All right. So you just want to get it lined up just a little above the bottom and centered within that zone. Get one side and just make sure that's stuck down. And there you go. Stickers on. Now the Game Boy's complete and ready to go. Now what I'll usually do is just plug these in. There's the port on the bottom. When you plug them in, you'll see the charge light. When it's blue, it's charging. As soon as it turns green, ready to play. And it takes about, for the first charge, I'm not sure how much power is in there, but for the first charge, it takes about 20-25 minutes. And then, you know, once it's dead, it might be 30-45 minutes for it to charge fully. But you'll be able to know once that turns green. All right, thanks guys, appreciate you watching, and I'll be on to the next Game Boy.